Welcome, everybody. My name is Artemis Bear, and I am a director of The Garden and also head of Freedom to Learn. And tonight, Tim is going to be presenting a session on Planfulness, which is how we collaborate with young people to create meaningful projects. The Garden is a self-directed learning community and has been running since 2016. And Freedom to Learn is a programme by Phoenix Education Trust, and we support people who are interested in young people's rights in education. There's just a little bit of housekeeping. So I hope I already have communicated well that we are recording this session. So if you don't want to be visible on the recording, which will be made public, then please hide yourselves now. If you are hiding yourself from your video, your name won't be visible either. You can put introductions and any questions you have in the chat, and we will try to answer them at the end. And the recording should be available on the Freedom to Learn YouTube very soon, and I will send everyone a link once it's up so you can look back at it as well. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Tim. He's going to tell you all about Planfulness.
Okay. It says you've disabled my screen sharing.
Oh, I don't think it was enabled, but I will see if I can. It's in the video section, isn't it?
Yeah. I can just start because it's just an introduction screen at the moment. So yeah, Planfulness, maybe a slightly odd word. I got it from the Alliance for Self-Directed Education's website, where they talk about the 4 educative drives. So there is curiosity, playfulness, sociability, and what they call planfulness. And these are things that all children innately have, and which, if they are allowed to just express naturally, then they create the conditions for self-directed education to flourish, essentially. I'm doing an unschooled master's, or I'm trying to. It's been reasonably successful. I guess I'm a quarter of the way through. So I decided, whilst thinking about what I could do an unschooled master's on, that I would take each of these 4 educative drives and essentially use each one as the basis for a module. So I've undertaken some action research at the Garden on planfulness, and it stretches in school terms about a term. So it was what we call seasons, so that's a half term essentially. So it's I started in the season before Easter, and then ran into the season after Easter, and then there was a little bit of stuff also in the last season before the summer. So that's the time frame. We're looking at a couple of months basically, where I undertook some ethnography and lots of thinking and reading, and we implemented lots of things and tried them out, and asked young people specifically what was working and what wasn't around how we were doing planning, projects, and meetings. So Artemis said we're from the Garden. We also have a program called the BLC, the Bristol Learning Community. Most of this was focused around those young people who are in that project. They're generally 10 and older, and they just do more extensive planning than the people who are what we call the Garden. We slip between the terms occasionally, but if I say the Garden, I primarily probably mean younger people, and if I say the BLC, I'm talking about people who are 10 plus and doing more extensive planning. I made this mock-up of our board, so our structure of our week has changed quite a lot over the process. This is in February this year, this is what our the core meetings that we had look like. So every morning we'd have a meeting for half an hour, and then on a Tuesday we have what we call a project lab, which is where the people in the BLC will come together for an hour and they will do like a review session of all the projects that they're working on. So it was split into roughly two halves. The first half would be a reflection on the previous week, and then the second half they would set their intentions for what they wanted to do, working towards those goals they had for this week. And then we have another meeting called Set the Week at 12, and that's where we came together with an option for the younger group from the garden to join us, and we would populate this board with all the projects that we wanted to do. Yeah, we also have a community meeting at the end there on a Thursday, so that was a whole community meeting. So if you're in the BLC, you're doing 3 hours of like big meetings, plus your little morning meetings and afternoon meetings where we're just checking in and checking out, doing daily intentions and daily reflections. I'm going to present a lot of triangles. I'm going to, throughout this talk, when I started this research, I had a few thoughts in mind about how we were doing planning and projects, and a few things that I was certain that we were going to change. And one of those was around meetings, and how we were doing morning meetings. And one of them was around sort of the tools that we were using, because we were on the path to becoming sort of an ALC, which is an Agile Learning Centre. And that path I felt was sort of going to accelerate throughout the project. This triangle is about meetings. My choice of word at the bottom there, efficiency, is maybe slightly odd for sort of self-directed education. You don't really think of self-directed education as being sort of optimizing for efficiency, but in this context, all of those meetings are meetings where people are required to come, so they're mandatory meetings. And in settings where we are seeking to optimize for autonomy and people's agency, whenever you have a meeting which becomes mandatory, you're no longer offering people the autonomy to opt out. So by efficiency in this context, I really mean if you're going to take someone's time and say, yeah, well, you have to be here, you really need to be efficient with that time if you would like to respect someone's autonomy. If they are feeling like, actually, this isn't really working for me, if your meeting's taking twice as long as it needs to, then they're not having the agency to walk out if your expectation is that people stay for the meeting. So there's a balance between what I would call efficiency, which is trying to optimize for time, but also personality, which is people's ability to express themselves in meetings. You want people to feel free to be the person they want to be. And sometimes you might create conditions where those two things are in tension. You've got this ability to be efficient. You want people to progress through the meeting as quick as possible, but then you also want people to have fun. You want the meeting to be somewhat expansive. You want people to have a joke at different times, and you want people to feel like, actually, I can just turn up and I can be myself, and it's not just like, let's get this over with as quick as possible. So you want both of those things in the meeting, and sometimes that might be at a tension. And then culture on the third side of the triangle is there in part because meetings obviously have a culture. You have each meeting that you're running, people would turn up and the meeting itself has a culture and they get used to the idea of how the meeting runs, and the meeting has a culture. But it's mainly there also because each setting has a culture, and sometimes it felt for me that meetings were trying to take the culture that exists outside of the meeting that the young people are naturally operating within and trying to bring it into the meeting in a way that's sometimes felt very performative, which I felt was in tension with this idea of efficiency, like having meetings that were performative and were going on for longer than they should have so that we could sort of demonstrate our culture. Sometimes felt like actually that's just really not that useful. And I have a story of something that happened in one of the first few weeks of doing this research, which sort of exemplifies that. And that was that they have these two groups, the Garden and the BLC, and we had these separate morning meetings. And on a Thursday morning, there was a workshop that was being run in our yurt, which was in February, quite high demand, obviously, as a warm space. And so we had a morning meeting, and we had this little bit of half-hour dead time where the yurt was technically free and the workshop was not yet started. And so in the meeting I was in with the older group, they really wanted to play Monopoly. And they spent about 10 minutes negotiating, being respectful of each other and taking it in turns, using hands in felt like quite a long-winded process to agree how they were going to start and play Monopoly. And as I left that meeting, I thought that took 10 minutes, but these young people, they could just have sorted that out in a normal conversation within like 30 seconds. And so I'm wandering over with them to the yurt thinking, oh, that wasn't really that efficient. That seemed like a bit of a waste of time. And we get to the yurt and we find that actually the younger group had been undertaking the same process, another 10-minute meeting where they negotiated how they were going to use this yurt, which they wanted to use for wrestling. And so they'd gone through the same process. There's 10 minutes of like, let's talk about this in rounds, and let's plan this in. And then we both arrive and we're like, oh no, we have double booked this. And so this rather simple process of either how should we wrestle together or how should we play Monopoly now was a much more complicated, oh dear, we're all trying to use this space. But within 30 seconds, everyone just sort of mingled. Some people took control. Some people were happy to take a backseat. Everyone was able to have a chance to speak if they wanted to. Some people didn't. And within 30 to 45 seconds, the space had been negotiated. There was a bit of wrestling in this corner. There was a Monopoly here. There was a clear division. And it was like, if this division is breached, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage that? And everyone managed to share the space for 25 minutes before the workshop started. And it just exemplified that actually the culture that we have outside of meetings is strong enough that actually do we need to have meetings, and do we need to have things happen inside of meetings as much as we do when young people are actually really competent at negotiating things? And are we being really performative in how we use meetings? And so that was a key sort of thought process that I held, a question, I guess, which I held throughout the whole 2-month process. I present this triangle, and there will be other ones, as sort of a triangle with a center in which there is never really a center, because the center is always moving. And the questions that I ask that come out of the triangles are questions that never have an answer to them. There's never, this is the way to do it. And that's important to recognize. They're sort of guiding lights, if you will, to constantly come back to and wonder, okay, well, how do we tweak it a little bit more? What's in this, with this different blend of young people, what do we need? But the questions are always there of like, okay, how can we keep tweaking it? Which I think is going to be a theme as we go through, that actually it's all about having those questions continuously asked and continually tweaking and continually thinking about them. Yeah, so this is just a quote that's, I think, a really good explanation of culture. So culture is the past expressed in the present moment. but yeah, well, let's move on. So this is a project that happened. This was actually the project which made me think about how we do planning. This happened the last week of term, the season before, in which I went off for a break, and I was like, wow, actually, this might be a really interesting thing to do some action research on. So this is a project someone wanted to do on the Romans. And this was what our board looked like from our set the week meeting. So we had a trip on the Wednesday to go out to the Narroways, which is just next door. It's like a nature reserve. And then on the Thursday, we were going to do writing workshop. And then they booked in this Romans project. And then there was a offering for some in bulk celebration that one of the other mentors had made. The offering was made. Some people were sort of into it, but no one had fully signed up to it, which is quite an important part of the story. So we come back in on a Thursday, and the trip was wildly successful. Everyone was super excited about it. And the first thing they wanted to do was to do it again, basically. Well, let's just do that again. So in our morning meeting, we were like, okay, well, that's a reasonable request, but like the day's fairly booked out already. There's people who are doing writing, some people are committed to this Romans project, and then we have this in bulk thing that we offered earlier, and some people have said they sort of fancy doing it. So like, where would we fit this in to our board? And we suggested that maybe actually it'd be best to do it next week on a Tuesday. We can plan it in already, and we can put it in early, so we don't it can be like one of the first things we put in before we do the set the week meeting, and let's just book it now. But the young people were really, really keen to actually just go and do the Narroways trip. So one of the first things that ended up happening was that the mentor who'd made the offering for in bulk said, well, not everyone is like committed to it. They've just been like a general sense that some people want to do it. So why don't we sort of move that? I will shelve that. We won't do that to create some space for people to go on this trip. But they needed 2 hours to go on this trip. So now we were left with this problem of this Romans project. But as it happened, I thought, well, what is that teaching our young people, that actually as mentors, we're willing just to give up on something that we want to do? That there's a hidden curriculum of how we deal with the timetable, how we deal with our projects, and how we deal with planning them. So what does that signal to the young people if we as adults are also willing to say, actually, I won't do the thing that I want to do? And the young person said, well, I won't do the Romans project either, but then maybe I'll do it earlier. So there was a request then, actually, can I do the Romans project at 11 with the writing workshop? Because they wanted to do it with me, and I was doing writing in the year. And I said, okay, well, I can maybe try and find some space to do writing and Romans at the same time. But the underlying message to that young person then is, actually, I'm not willing to give you my full attention to do the thing that I wanted to do. And so even though they'd planned it to happen within half an hour, and they said, actually, yeah, that's what I want to do, actually it ended up that they never bothered coming, and the project didn't actually happen for about another 2 months before they actually felt reignited to come back and do this Romans project. And so there was a question there about, how do we as mentors hold the space of a meeting to allow the young people the freedom to actually pursue the projects they wanted to do? So this is how the board ended up looking like after everyone had negotiated everything away. Essentially, writing and Romans were meant to be together, but they just didn't bother coming, and everyone went on the trip instead. And it made me question, okay, well, where does commitment for projects come in? What is our desire to ensure that actually when young people say they want to do a project, how do we make sure that we offer them the tools and the space to be able to commit to things fully? And obviously, we don't want to hold them always to the things that they planned at all times. There is a space for genuine rest when people are actually too tired to undertake things. And there is a space for playful refusal when either they're in the midst of something and they don't want to stop playing to come and do the thing that they said they were going to do, or they refuse because another opportunity, like going back over the road to the nature reserve, comes up. But for them to be fully given the autonomy to be able to own the commitment and make the decision themselves, that it requires a discussion. And the discussion that was had in the meeting made me wonder, well, is that the space that's given that young person the right opportunity to be able to make the commitment that they want? What should the discussion look like? Should the discussion actually happen in a group? Is it appropriate in a meeting? Does some young people need a more individual discussion? Do you need to have a one-on-one with them in some way away from the group? How can we reconcile the social pressure in the individual? One of the things that comes up a lot, which I think the next triangle talks about, is that we've noticed in the garden that not everyone fits into this binary neatly, but there are almost two types of young people. There are people who are unschooling all the way through, so at home they're unschooling and they come to the garden and they're self-directing their education, and for them we notice there's a sort of a continuum of their education that they feel there's a consistency throughout, and so projects happen at home but also can happen at the garden. Projects are things they're interested in, and that might happen at home or at the garden, and they're much more willing to engage in projects. Whereas the other side is someone who maybe is doing a lot of online curriculum stuff at home, and their education is taken care of with a lot of stuff at home, so they come into the garden 3 days a week and they consider it like, this is, I've done my education, this is my social space. So both those people are in meetings with these sort of competing needs, and who is placing more pressure on the other, especially for the younger group? Like how easy is it for the one person who has said, I want to do a Romans project, in the face of all 7 or 8 other people saying, no, let's go on this trip to the Narroways, to stand firm and say, actually, I'd like to honor the commitment I made to myself, in the face of all their peers and friends saying, actually, it'd be more fun to go over the road and play some big game of tag. So how do meetings and how do we as facilitators hold the space, I guess, more to the point, in meetings to allow this to happen? Like, how do we allow things to happen collaboratively? One of the other things that I was noticing is, like, how do you name a project? Amelia's here from the greenhouse, and Cedar is a co-worker of them, and said this amazing thing of like, well, when does a project become a project? Like, some people sit around at the greenhouse drinking cups of tea and making pot noodles and have a club called Pot Noodle Club and having a chat, and that is their project. Like, how do we as adults, how can we even define like what a project is? And we had a sewing club where people were sewing. There was 3 or 4 of them sewing all together, and these were like 11, 12-year-olds, and they were doing this, sewing a bag, and it was sort of a project where they were sewing, but it sort of became more and more apparent that actually it was more what I would call as like a side-by-side activity. It was almost like the sewing itself was a thing that they could do with their hands whilst they were having the chat, whilst they were together. It was almost like the act of going off and doing this sewing was creating this sort of smaller group where actually they were meeting their social needs just as much as they were actually getting an actual bag completed and had at the end of it. So how do we create that social space or the collaboration, or what you might call like deep work, which is, I guess, what I mean by that is like when a young person goes, right, actually, I'm fully invested in this project, I'm doing this. This is the thing that I'm just enraptured by in this moment, and I'm just going to focus everything on there. And again, as I say, these are not meant to be questions with answers per se, but these were the noticings in the first few months and the questions that I was pondering as we were coming up to Easter. So I'm going to go back because I've missed something out. So I'm going to talk about the second change we made there, but actually the first change we made within a few weeks, which was one of the advantages I noticed of doing action research and writing loads of stuff down was I just decided to record as much stuff as I could. So I was recording the start times and the end times of every meeting we did. And we noticed that at the start of the day, though we said in our handbook that when our times were, meetings were meant to start at 10, we would shut the gate at 10. Often, our meetings might not start at 10. A young person might arrive late, or there might be a parent with a question, and we found ourselves drifting into sort of 10:15. Meetings would start sometimes at 10:20. And if you think back to the first slide where I showed you our week on a Tuesday where there were lots of meetings, if a meeting was starting if the meeting was starting slightly later on a Tuesday for the BLC and the older group, they had back-to-back meetings on the Tuesday morning. That just ended up dragging, and they felt like they basically didn't have a day by the time they'd finished all their meetings. So we were recording the times of when they started, and just also like a qualitative, how did that day go? There was a clear pattern of like when we actually stuck to our 10 o'clock, the day went so much more smoothly. The things that we'd planned were much more likely to happen. And so within a few weeks, we said to parents, 10 o'clock is the start, and that's always historically been the time, but we're going to be actually quite firm with it. And at 10 o'clock, we're going to shut the gate and we're going to go up. And it made such a massive difference. The days drastically changed. We thought that we would get kickback, but actually parents were super positive with the change we made. Young people were faced with a consequence that we didn't realize parents sort of wanted. They were like, yeah, the first day someone was late and we were like, oh, this is going to be an awkward conversation. But they were like, thanks, that's great. They've had a consequence that's real, rather than me saying, oh, we're going to be late. It's an actual consequence that they can actually embody. I was so happy that it's you've made that change. And the days just literally ran so much more smoothly. On the second day, there were a couple of things that people had planned to start at 11, but actually because the meeting started on time and it was actually super short and really brief, by 5 to 11, both the things that had been planned that they wanted to do at 11, people had already just cracked on and done, and the rest of the day was sort of free. People just ended up having more time and just having a much more enjoyable day. So then this was the second change we made. So on the right is sort of our weekly plan board. But what we started to do was create some scaffolding for where people should highlight the things that they wanted to do. So we had 3 sort of stages. We had a morning meeting where we spoke about intentions, so everyone would get a chance to set an intention. And one of the things we noticed were that things that really should be intentions were then being raised in our sort of planning stages. So one of my colleagues, Bess, is by far the best at woodworking and whittling, and there was sort of, again, a cultural perception that Bess was therefore the person you would ask to do whittling with because they were the most skilled. But it's not really true. Like, any of us can access the tools and provide some support, but there became a cultural understanding that you had to plan in some whittling time with Bess if you wanted to do whittling, when actually you could just set that as an intention so that a mentor was aware, and the mentor could then, any mentor could then support you by getting out the tools when you wanted them, and just setting you off. So we wanted to demonstrate what were things that you could just tell a mentor, and what was therefore just an intention, and that would be enough to support that with you. What was an offering, where you actually needed to make it more clear to the other young people in the space, but also the mentor. And so we attached, so you've got on the left, you've got names, so that's the person who was doing the offering or the request, if it was something you wanted support with, the project, what it was, and then this section here of needs, where there was, what is it that you actually need to make this happen? So is it a mentor? Is it some space? Do you need people to commit to it? What resources do you need? So we changed, this was for our set the week meeting, so we changed our meeting format to reflect that actually the purpose of planning is to plan because you have these particular needs. You have a need to have a mentor available, or the space, or commitment, or resources, and often it would be more than just one of those things that was required. And this lasted about 2 weeks, and then we just rubbed it all off and got rid of it, because within 2 weeks the young people had internalized, I get it, some things I can just say, some things I need to plan, and some things are projects which are on doing. So at the bottom here we have doing, so these were our sort of ongoing projects. So when we came to our meeting, we would circle through the doing things, put those on the board, the things that are sort of an ongoing project, and anything that was an offering that was sort of just for that week that required some more planning, we could then move on to and then schedule that in. And that was really helpful and successful, I think, to help people realize what the purpose of intentions were as much as what the purpose of planning was. So this is, yeah, so this is about, I guess, offerings really, and trying to get a balance between offerings and free play. And one of the other things we really wanted to do was to create the conditions for young people to come to us with the things they wanted to do outside of the meeting space. It felt almost like there was too much time spent on planning, which is why we wanted people to just bring some of the things they wanted to do as intentions and not have to talk about them and sort of barter space and time on the board, and make them too big of a deal. We actually wanted to have, if anything, less discussions around projects within the meetings, because we'd noticed that young people would finish the meeting and they'd have raised something that they really wanted to do, and as a mentor you think, right, now I'm going to just quickly just slide over there and have a little chat about that with them and see if there's anything we might be able to sort of arrange, or if they needed any sort of further clarification on what they could use to make that happen. But they would then be like, what are you doing talking to me? The meeting is over. That's when we plan stuff. I am out of here to go and have some fun and play. And we were trying to find a way where actually we wanted a culture where the meeting ended and you sort of wanted to stay and talk about your project, rather than it feeling like you only could talk about projects in planning and that planning was taking up so much of that meeting. So it was a drive really to narrow down what people said in the meeting, to just a short an intention, and then we would try and follow that up outside of the space in a much more playful way. Yeah, and then the last one there, which is adults doing meaningful work, is something that I think learning communities are going to struggle to provide, not because of any failings of learning communities, but mainly because of just resourcing, low staffing numbers, and just yeah, it's just, I think that's a broader cultural issue of how do we give young people access to adults doing meaningful work. And what we tried different ways throughout this to do so. We had a writing workshop, which turned into someone requesting an offering for, can you do a writing workshop where we can do some writing? Because it started as me just blocking out an hour and I was just writing in the year. And I was writing essays and mind mapping the essays, how I would organize them in my head. I was sort of trying to scaffold that for young people by putting that on paper and just leaving them around and sort of making it into like a chaotic writing studio that people could play Lego around me as I was writing. Trying to create conditions, yeah, where adults are actually just doing stuff. And I guess it worked in a way that it turned from that into an offering where young people were actually like, actually, we want that as an offering after they witnessed it. But it meant that I was no longer doing that. They took that hour where I was doing that and it became a workshop. But again, the question is, yeah, how do we find the balance in all of those is a hard question for, I guess, people at learning communities. So that was sort of my initial research, pondering, writing, and reflections in the first season coming up to Easter. And then we sort of started implementing some more changes. So agile, becoming more agile. So that's becoming more like an agile learning center, which uses agile tools. That's like an agile learning centers, if you don't know, are sort of an American educational model where they've taken agile tools out of software development and sort of adapted them for young people. So our Bristol Learning Community was, the way we were running the project was derived from the Self-Managed Learning College in Brighton. So there's two main parts to it. We have the development week, which is a whole intense week of 3 days, where we spend half a day each on these 5 questions with the young people, and then a half a day at the end to sort of synthesize it all together and create a plan that they would use for the next 12 weeks to work towards, with their goals. And then obviously every week we would do a review of what they did that was on their goal that they planned to do, or what they didn't, and we'd sort of ask them why and get them to reflect on what they could have done differently. And then we'd spend half an hour asking them what they intended to do next week to work towards their goals, and what support they needed and resources, and what like timings they wanted to do it. So we'd been running this for about 1.5 years at this point. But we made quite a lot of changes over Easter. And we had 4 main, I like made notes, and I consider like these 4 main feedbacks of wanting to change. The first was myself. I felt like the questions themselves were really good and the model was, there's nothing wrong with it, but it felt like I was acting out someone else's someone else's play in a sense. It felt like I would like to take the questions, but just do it my way. Just tweak it ever so slightly. It felt like if we could just start from scratch, how would I do the same thing, or I guess, how would we do the same things, ask the same similar questions, and how would we get to the same answers just with our own style? We were lucky enough to have a visitor, Simon, who came from Japan, who had a background in democratic education, who came in and sort of spotlighted a lot of things that he was noticing in young people from a very slightly different perspective. And yeah, he gave us some really super helpful feedback. I had a really big call with a bunch of different facilitators from ALCs across the UK. And there was a question from some people at the greenhouse about there seems to be like a lot of writing, and how would that work with a dyslexic person? And we actually had someone who was dyslexic who had done a couple of seasons with us working on the program, and it hadn't been a problem. We'd made some adjustments for them, but in that question, it made me realize what is the purpose of all of these questions we ask people? And it's not really recording the data, it's just about getting people to think. And so that really sat with me, this idea of, okay, well, thinking is key and actually documenting is secondary. And then the young people themselves, these are some quotes that we received from them during some of the meetings. They particularly didn't like how many meetings there were on a Tuesday, so they felt quite strongly that they were tied down in meetings. They wanted a life, but also some quite honest ones about how they would struggle, what kind of adjustments we could make. Some people wanted computers, and some people just didn't really understand what it was that was stopping them from doing the thing. They just knew that there was something that which actually it just wasn't working for them. So yeah, so we made quite a lot of changes. We decided that we would use Kanban boards. The meetings that we were doing every week, where we were having a reflection and then setting an intention, were almost in two parts. And this is what a Kanban board looks like. So you've got a to-do section on the left, then you've got, which is all the things you need to do to complete a project, your doing section, which is the things obviously you're in the middle of doing. So, and then a done section when you've completed a task. So it's fairly simple. But you can see here, there's actually three columns to this. And we realized that actually when we were reflecting, looking back at the things we'd done, that was all well and good, but then it was really hard for young people to try and find a way to go into setting an intention and be like, well, what am I going to do for this week to work towards these goals? And it became clear that actually sometimes we were asking them to do sort of both the to-do section and the doing section almost simultaneously, come up with a list of things that they might do that week, and then select which ones of those would be the best to do in which order, and then bring them into their plan. So as well as moving to a Kanban board, we actually changed the format of the meeting to reflect that actually there are three separate sections. So there should be three separate sections to our meetings. We'll start with done. We'll do a reflection of the week that's gone. Then we'll move to the to-do section, and we'll look at people's to-dos. We'll say, do you have lots in there? Do you need to populate more? And that became sort of the meat of the meeting. And then the doing section is fairly easy. Once you have all your to-dos listed, you're just sliding them across and going, well, actually, I could do this, 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 and this. And that third section then became a lot quicker and easier for people. Yeah, I said about dyslexia and realizing that actually it's thinking that's key and documentary is secondary. So we tried to create a thinking environment. And one of the ways we decided to do that was that young people had clearly expressed they didn't want to write. So we kept the forms that we were using, but instead of asking people to record what they'd done and what they wanted to do on the forms, we instead decided that they would just tell us and we would write for them. So they would just be free to speak and think and be like, okay, well, what am I going to do? And they would just talk to the group, and we would as mentors scribe what they said in rough note form, and then there would be a section at the end of the meeting where actually they would get to look at those notes, and if they were satisfied that actually you've captured what I've said, that's fine, then they could just file it away. But then if they were like, well, actually I'd also like to add a little bit of detail now you've put the bones of what I said down, then they had an opportunity to do that as well. And that was really successful when we trialed that. They loved not having to write and just being able to speak. And we started to use Trello, which is basically an online Kanban board. A lot of our young people come and they want to do projects that don't necessarily have to happen or will happen in the space. So they're doing a lot of projects which they're doing planning in the week with us, but actually undertaking at home in the evenings and the weekends. So one of the things we added to our Trello board was a section in between the doing and the done, where instead of a young person moving something they've just done into the done section, we had a review section. So young people now move it into the review, and us as mentors then get a notification that someone's essentially completed a task, and we can then log in, see what the task is they've completed, and then we can add a note to that and ask them a question, or a reflective question essentially, where they can then reflect, or they can a question that will get them to maybe document some more, so they have some documentation around it, and then they're having the opportunity to do the reflecting outside of the space. They're able to do something in the evening, get the question of like, okay, how did that work for you? What could you have done differently? And they might answer that within an hour of actually having done the task itself. So we're almost distributing the thinking and the reflecting over time, so that when they come to the meetings, instead of having to think all of these questions anew, maybe hopefully a lot of them they'll have already had the chance to reflect on that task with us online, and they can just sort of speak it instead of having to think it, which brings the cognitive load of the whole meeting down, is the plan. We listened to their requests for meeting heavy Tuesdays to go, so we moved our project lab to a Thursday, so we put it pretty much near the end of the week, so now it has a sort of more of a reflective feeling. You start with the reflection at the end of the week, and then you set your intention for next week. And we also changed our community meetings. That was for the whole garden group, and the BLC, to become semi-optional. So there was a lot less mandatory meetings in general. So our board now look like that. So they've coming in, they're setting the week at 11 instead of 12. They've got a few hours then for the rest of the day. And then, the project lab was moved to a Thursday. One of the other tools that we use, so when a young person said at the start of the season in the development week that they had a goal, what that goal was, we use this thing, which is an agile tool called a learning sprint. So on the this is an example one we did. So on the left is possibilities. So this was one where we did for the Romans project. So your possibilities are anything that you can think about that have anything to do with the Romans. You just brain dump anything you could think about. Some of it is, but this is a lot of information, but it also might be sources where you would get that information, people that might access it, names of museums where you might go, anything that you can possibly think about, you put down and just have it in your possibilities. The learning groups themselves are made up of people where they're meant to share their reflections with each other on a weekly basis. So they were getting to know each other's projects and getting to know what each other were up to. So we created a suggestions section in the middle where, after you'd completed all the possibilities, you would share it with all your peers, and they would write essentially suggestions as possibilities that your peers have thought of that maybe you haven't yet documented. And then you create a story, which some of the young people did not like. Story, it was not the right word. Project or research proposal. So this is a question essentially where you synthesize things from the possibilities and the suggestions into a question that you can then try and answer over a 3 or 4 week period. And these are actual questions that young people came up with around the Romans project. So someone wanted to make a play about the Romans and all the different entertainments. That was the person who said, are they entertained? Was one of the things that the Romans were massively interested in. And then there was lots of stuff about food, empire, conquering lands, and the vastness of how large the empire was, and pizza. Was pizza invented by the Romans or not? Which there was a large debate about. And they brought some of those more disparate topics together into this question of where did the food that the average citizen in Rome eat come from? And then from there you move to the right and you just create a task list of all the things you would do at this stage that you can think of to go about answering that question. We trialed this with them the week before Easter and some of these changes, and it was massively successful. They were absolutely delighted. So we were really excited to come back after Easter to see how well it went. And it was a disaster. They decided after Easter that actually they were wrong. They hated the whole thing. We'd made a massive mistake, and the whole process was awful. It was just as awful as it was before. So after 2 weeks, I sat in a meeting and it lasted 6 minutes when it should have been an hour. And it was one of the worst meetings I've ever been in. There was no energy in the room. Some people just didn't even bother speaking. And so I decided to just write on the board, okay, co-creation. And I wrote, these are the non-negotiables. These were the things that I considered the things around which, the bones around which we'd thought about all the changes, and the things that we'd done, all of those changes had been done in the context of these are the things that we need to achieve. And they were that we share what we did with everyone in a group. So everything was done to spoken to all of your peers. So everyone got to know you and everyone was meant to listen so that they can then give feedback to all the people in the group. And the reason we do this is that the reflection process and that cycle leads to progression over time. So how are we going to do this? And so these were some of the things they said, which were pretty incredible. So giving feedback is hard because I feel I have no reason to listen to people, even though I know that's wrong. It was a very honest one. My favorite is the third one down, which when a young person said, this system is not funneling the information towards me in a way that I can work with. I need something to work with that can grab my attention better. I knew from that moment that something had to change. You can't have a 12-year-old articulate that so articulately towards you and not do something about it. So we negotiated all of those negotiables away. We decided that we wouldn't share with the group. We would just share in pairs. So we'd work in partners. We agreed that actually that allows us to listen still, and we can give feedback to the people. And the young people said it would be a lot easier to give feedback to one person than it would to have to hold the attention and give feedback to everyone in the group. we did realize that actually, though the young people didn't need to give feedback to everyone in the group, it was my role as a mentor to give feedback to everyone in the group. So my job then became, they decided that I would try and sort of circulate around the pairs and then have short little meetings one-to-one with everyone at the end, just to make sure there's nothing I'd missed. And that if we did that, then that would allow that progression over time. And we agreed that we would use Trello in the way I said earlier. Everyone committed to actually using it online so that we could also have that reflection and progression and feedback individually with all the things that they did at home. So hopefully when we come into the meetings, I would know already a lot of what they'd done outside of the meeting. And it wouldn't be so important if I missed some of those things that they were sharing with their peers. And actually, after we committed to that for 3 weeks, and after 3 weeks, we actually decided, or they decided more to the point that actually they didn't even want to meet in pairs. They just preferred to just have a one-to-one session with me. And so that's, at the moment, is now what we do. We meet for around 20 minutes, one-to-one, and we just go through the reflection intention cycle together. They don't always use Trello as much as they promised they would, but it seems to be working, and they're much happier doing the process now that they've co-created it themselves. And actually, I gave this talk over the conference over the summer, and I sort of ended it there. But actually, over the last month, these things come around in cycles, and it's starting to become sort of apparent that some people in the group actually are needing that collaborative space to share their projects with other people. And so I'm sure that over the next sort of month or so, there will be more tweaking, and we will end up somewhat closer back to that sort of learning group operating as a group rather than just as one-to-ones. It's 2 minutes past. That was the change in between Easter and leading up to the half term. And we made one more change, which we decided to do after the half term, which was in response to a lot of our young people feeling like they couldn't find that balance between deep work, collaboration, and social space, because they felt that anytime they planned some projects, they just felt their day was getting swallowed up. They couldn't find the time to have both projects and the social space that they needed to. And previously we were working on hour blocks. And so what we decided to do was just to change our whole schedule around. I took this picture earlier. I should have checked it for the stray arm blocking out some of the timings. But we moved to having 45-minute slots. So instead of having 11 till 12, 12 till 1, 1 till 2 as our 3-hour blocks that people could plan projects in, we now have 5 slots a day. They're all 45 minutes. We found that actually most things that young people plan, when they plan them for an hour, very rarely last an hour. They mostly are sort of done within 40 minutes anyway. And there are some things which are a bit longer and will take longer. And so things we have D&D, which is a big thing at the moment. So that you can just book that for a double slot. But most things are going to be 45 minutes maximum. And so the young person in particular who was finding it really challenging to plan things in, if he wanted to do 2 things in a day, he was spending what he felt like, even though necessarily it wasn't taking up that much time, 2 hours out of his 3 doing projects and only 1 hour to actually socialize with his friends. Now, if he wants to plan 2 things in, he's only spending 40% of his day doing projects, and he feels like he's got way more time on his hands to actually hang out with his friends, and he can schedule things at the start of the day and at the end of the day, and he feels like he's got a massive chunk of time in the middle. And you can also see this sort of very thin lunch section. We had 15 minutes sort of spare after we played around with all of that, and we decided to put in a lunch break, which the young people at the garden just eat whenever they want to eat. Mostly in our check-in meeting, everyone's lunch is eaten within half an hour. Classic. Sometimes it tempts me and I do the same thing and then I really regret it. But we put a lunch break in, not for us really to eat lunch as adults, but more to have 15 minutes in the day where we could all sit down together and have a sort of a mini check-in. If there's any sort of bubbling social issues, we can just have a little chat. We can all be brought up to speed about anything that's happened in the morning before we move into the afternoon. And also it's a nice framing where the three adults in the space are sat all together, and it sort of invites those conversations I was saying earlier about trying to get more conversations about doing things outside of meetings. It just creates a little space in the day where people who are wandering through what we call our lounge area can stop and have a chat, and things can come up that we can then say, oh, that sounds like a project. Oh, that sounds like something we could help you with this afternoon. Let's just go and do that now. And it's been really successful, actually. Yeah. And that is it. That is sort of where we ended 2 months later down the line. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Tim. That was so interesting. And I kind of know it all already, and it was still really interesting. I'm aware that it's now gone 9, and we did say it would only be an hour, but I still think an hour, 6 minutes past, not bad for our first webinar, really, is it? It's not too bad for timekeeping. If anyone needs to go, obviously do go. But Tim, are you happy to answer some questions if anyone has any questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay for a bit.
So Sarah says, would love to hear a couple of examples of projects or goals that went through this process. So that might have been before you gave some examples.
Yeah. So projects that have gone through the process. Well, we have quite a lot of cooking interest, I guess, is one thing. And we had someone go from, they sort of were doing a strong cooking vibe, and then they ended up creating a fermenting club. We had, which was pretty cool, they did fermenting pretty much every week for the whole of the last term before the summer. We have had some bigger projects which are sort of more ongoing. I had a meeting today with a young person who before the summer wanted to build a wind turbine, which is quite a massive project, and has come back from the summer just as excited about building a wind turbine, which is quite interesting. We've had a lot of people who are interested in, at the older ages, who are interested in doing GCSEs and GCSE maths. So we actually did a version of that learning sprint as a collaborative. So trying to find the things that everyone wanted to do from wherever they were in their maths journey, and trying to find the common maths topic that everyone could work at. And we spent the whole of last season doing year 8 algebra from a textbook, which as a qualified maths teacher does pain me that that is the thing that they want to do. I find it utterly bizarre. But yeah, but they loved it. And we spent an hour a week doing algebra out of a textbook. And that's carried on this year. They wanted to do division today, this season, and we did some division today.
I'd say the size of the projects varies enormously, doesn't it? Because some projects can literally just be, oh, we're going to do this today. There's not a huge amount of planning involved, but you can still. I think some of the aspects of this still apply even in these little micro projects because they're still thinking things through in the same way because they've had that example from attempting it with larger projects, even if they haven't completed a larger project. The way we kind of keep track of it on Trello, I think is really. I found Trello really helpful actually. The fact that we can look back on things and look back at how things have moved through in the fermenting club in particular, it was so useful to be able to say, oh right, okay, I've broken it down as these individual tasks and they're right there and I can see what I did last week, I can see what I'm going to do this week, and refer to it as the things you did in the past to go as a reference point to how you're going to do things in the future, particularly when you're doing iterative things, is super helpful.
Yeah, so on Trello, when we use Trello, we have a to-do, a doing, and a done. And then what we do is at the end of the week, we take that done and we write what the date of the end of the week is. And then we sort of move that across and then bring in another section for done. So if they, over time, if they keep going right, they've got to do, doing, and then they got that week's done, but they have got all the other previous weeks just pushed along so they can just slide across and see, oh, what did I do last week? Oh, the 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. So they can see all of the things they've completed on a weekly. I think actually, yeah, it's hard to remember them all to be honest, but actually a really successful one was a bride DJ disco workshop. So it was a young person wanted to DJ at the Youth Pride party, and so they ran a set of workshops for I think 6 weeks for other teens to come and learn how to DJ to do it with them. So they ran a set of workshops for 6 weeks, which was really well attended, and then all of the people who sort of come to then could then come along to this party at the end and do some DJing. So that was a really successful, quite nicely time-bound project as well.
Yeah.
Do we have
any more questions? No. Oh, there's one more message. No, just a thank you. In that case, no, I guess not. Thanks everybody for coming along. Unless that's oh no. Thanks everybody. Yeah, nice to see so many lovely faces. We're hoping to do these webinars quite regularly. I think we're planning to do one per season, which is our 6-week block. So we will be in touch about when the next ones are going to be happening. So yeah, thank you very much and good night.